Did you know that vampires actually come from Slavic folklore, specifically South Slavics, which is the ex-Yugoslavia area? Yugo actually refers to south. So when I was in Serbia last year visiting the Golubački fortress Tvrđava, I came across a tour guide talking about vampire legends, and so naturally I started listening, and because I thought it would be interesting. And it turns out that back in the day when Serbia was occupied by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the officials who were overseeing the area, the Austrian-Hungarian officials, they were very puzzled by the local villager behavior. There were reported several incidents of villagers disinterring corpses from the grave, just digging them out and then re-killing them, as it were. And they questioned what was going on, and they found out that it was reportedly vampires were on the loose again. Vampires were often a way to explain away a lot of deaths in a village, because in a rural community, when a lot of people die in all at once, well, for one thing, that's not good for a village's survival. For another, you want to have some explanation. Why are all these people dying? And so what they would do is they would try to identify who was the vampire, who was the person responsible for killing all these people. So what they would do is they would bring a stallion, a young horse, cannot be gelded, it has to be a stallion, and take the stallion over the graves. And if there was a grave in particular that the stallion reacted to, freaked out about, it was highly likely that that was a vampire. So what they would do then is dig out that corpse and then investigate the corpse. If the corpse had properly decomposed and everything like a normal corpse should do, they're like, well, that's not the vampire. But there were very specific things they were looking for. They were looking for whether or not the corpse had decomposed or if it was just fine. There were incidents of finding a body where the beard had grown longer, like he hadn't had a beard before he died, but then he had a beard, his hair had grown longer, the nails had grown longer. But the biggest giveaway was if their cheeks were ruddy, red, as if they had been just drinking blood, or, just full of life. In the most famous tale of vampires in Serbia, the tale of Sava Savanović, in that story, they dug up his grave, and he had been a vampire for 90 years, secretly terrorizing the villages nearby. And he had become absolutely skeletal. His whole body was gaunt. His skin was white. But he still had his skin. His corpse had not decomposed. But what was notable about him was that his cheeks were fat and ruddy. In the tale I read, it was likened to a cherub in one of those older paintings with the fat, rosy cheeks. Imagine that on a vampire. Everything else is skeletal, but he's got those fat, rosy cheeks. So what do? You stab them with a hawthorn stake, and it's specifically while they're laying in the grave so that they don't get back up. You stab them through the heart while they're in their coffin. And in the story of Sava Savanović, what they did is they dug his coffin even deeper. They also poured holy water down his throat to drown him in holy water. They also brandished a crucifix to protect themselves. And then once they buried the grave deeper, they put river stones on top of the coffin to keep him down from being able to rise again, and reburied him. For they said in that story that vampires never can be killed, they never die, but you can keep them from rising again through these techniques. Oh, and they also planted a hawthorn tree on top of the grave, so that then, like, they started with a hawthorn bush that was already there that they transplanted, because hawthorn is the tree notable for protecting against evil spirits. So they planted the bush on top of the grave, and then the hawthorn tree would grow on top of his grave, thus preventing him from being able to rise again if the stake and the stones weren't enough. Now that's one legend, but pretty consistently across these Slavic tales is the element of needing a black hawthorn stake to kill the vampire. But other variations include burning the vampire, because, okay, if he's burnt, can't come back to terrorize you. But yeah, these tales are very specifically coming out of the Balkan area especially in Serbia. And I don't think a lot of people know that. But what happened was like during the Austrian-Hungarian occupation, the officials found out what the locals were doing, and they reported it back to their capital, which was Vienna. And that got covered in the newspapers, became very sensationalized because it's a very interesting story. And then various authors began to pick it up. It was picked up first really by Slovenian and Serbian authors, and then over time it made its way to the British Isles, where there were a few stories, actually quite a few stories written about vampires. The first one really came out of this little gathering of creative thinkers, and the physician of Lord Byron was actually the person who penned the first version. He kind of stole the idea from Byron, but then he expanded upon it and wrote it more out. And he then he claims that it was published without his consent, but he conveniently left it where they had that gathering, and somebody found it and published it. And then that led to a whole bunch of offshoots of vampire stories, where they were pretty much kind of the same stories. The story of an aristocrat traveling to Turkey and then somehow becoming a vampire, and then coming back to London to terrorize the citizens. But it's always an aristocrat, whatever the version is. And then over time, different variations occurred, with the vampires being more sexualized, coming into your bed and stealing your life force energy. And then, according to the source I read, it was around the First World War time that then female vampires became popular as well. But earlier than that, Bram Stoker, Irishman, he was a theater manager. He ended up reading a few different sources that had been kind of trickling that way to the British Isles. And he decided to write Dracula. And Dracula is a variation of the Romanian word for dragon. And as many of us know, he'd based Dracula off of this historical figure, Vlad Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, who was known for impaling his opponents on a stake through the abdomen and letting them viciously suffer and die. And that was something he learned while he had been imprisoned in the Ottoman Empire. That was a technique that they used, and he brought back to his area. And so yeah, Dracula became really popular, but it was only after the Austrian-Hungarian Empire were so baffled by what the Serbian peasants were doing to prevent vampire infestations in their village. And now, vampire stories were, of course, passed along for millennia. Who knows how long they've been part of the Serbian culture, that Balkan area. It's only until recently, when people start to write down these myths and legends, that they start to become customized and attributed to specific people. In the story that the book that I've been reading, which is a Slavic folklore book, the authors describe that there's differences between myths and fairy tales and folk tales. Myths usually have a religious component. That's what they say. I'm still kind of chewing on that one. I'm not sure if I quite agree if it's always that way. Because to me, I've seen myths be painted in a much broader category. But it's worth considering anyway. And then folk tales are the stories that don't have an author. They are just passed along from mouth to mouth, oral traditions that you don't know where that came from, but it's just been passed along for forever. And then fairy tales are basically folk tales that have an author. So with Cinderella and Rumpelstiltskin, you have the French author Charles Perrault. I'm not really sure how to say his last name. I'm not too great with French. The Grimm brothers, hilariously to me, actually paid a little girl to go listen to this old woman who was a wealth of folk tales, but she would only tell them to children. So the Grimm brothers paid this little girl to go hear the stories from this old lady, this grandma, and then come back and then they would write down the stories after she would tell the stories from the grandma. So if you've ever played the game of telephone, you know what that's like. So how much got lost in translation from the little girl to the grandma, or from the grandma to the little girl to then the Grimm brothers. But that's okay. The original message of the fairy tales or folk tales still lives on. And I'm grateful that they've been able to be preserved in this way, because in our society now we've really lost a lot of oral traditions, at least in so-called modern society. So with vampire legends, these were passed on for a long time, but it was only with the more recent, in the past few centuries, people writing them down and also just, being occupied by a foreign government to then basically be like, well, what's going on with these people? We don't know this culture. The legends were not familiar to the Austrian-Hungarian officials, so they had to find out what was going on, and then they reported it back, and the Empress was very interested in it, as were pretty much the general population. What's also interesting is that werewolves come from Serbian traditions as well. And now when I say Serbia, that's kind of a moving target over the centuries. The borders have changed a lot. So I'm saying that more for simplicity's sake, but I really do mean that sort of South Yugoslavian area. I mean, South Slavic area, aka ex-Yugoslavia area. But yeah, werewolves, according to the book I read, were sort of like a term, kind of like he who must not be named for Voldemort in Harry Potter, like a word that was so scary that then they started calling werewolves by the name of vampire, which means one who does not fly. So werewolves are too scary to say, so we would say vampires instead. But over time, they became two distinct supernatural entities. But there were, even among some of the early writers, some situations where the vampire and werewolf were interchangeable. And I remember from reading Dracula that at one point Dracula turned into a wolf. He turned into all sorts of things. He turned into a bat, a wolf. Well, those are the two I remember anyway. It's been a long time since I read that book. And so, of course, I'm not an expert. I'm just interested in this kind of thing, and I enjoy reading about it. And so what I'm just doing here is sharing what I've learned recently. And I think it's pretty cool, because I think it's interesting how the word vampire is probably the only word in our dictionary that is a direct translation from Serbian or those similar languages, that language group. Whereas English has become so globalized that as I learn a few other languages, Serbian included, Spanish, those are the primary ones I learn. It's, interesting and kind of, I don't know, feels weird to see English words for modern things, especially in their languages. But, English itself is such a bastardized language. We have so many French words, Germanic words. So it's like, who's to say, languages evolve and merge together over time as different forces come together. So, who's to say? But anyway, what I was just trying to say is that vampires are kind of one of the biggest legacies of Serbia, and most people don't even know it. And then a lot of people don't even know what Serbia is. I know, especially because I've married a Serbian, so I've learned a lot over the years. But we've met people who think he's from Siberia rather than Serbia. They're like, oh, it must be cold where you're from. I'm like, yeah, it's about as cold as New York gets, Serbia, but it's not like Siberia in the north of Russia. But, there's some similarities with the sound of their names in the Slavic regions, and that kind of thing. So yeah, vampires come from Serbia. Now the tale of Sava Savanović is interesting, if you'd like to hear it. So Sava Savanović was the most famous vampire in Serbia. I asked my husband if he knew about him, and he was like, yeah, how do you know about him? And it's like, oh, well, I'm reading this book. But he didn't actually really know the details of the story. He just kind of knew about Sava Savanović. In the 1970s, there was the first Serbian horror movie called Lepterica, written about Sava Savanović and his story. I guess you write a screenplay for a movie, and then the screenplay becomes a movie, so the movie's about Sava Savanović. So, it's kind of a strange story, as many folk tales tend to be. So, there were these two villages in Serbia along a river. I quite don't remember all the details of the geography, and many people wouldn't know them anyway. But it's a part of Serbia where there were two villages that were within walking distance of each other. They were pretty close, let's just say that. And they were two kind of rival villages. They would kind of make fun of each other. And in one of the villages, there lived a young man by the name of Strahinja. And I did not check my husband for pronunciation on the name, so I might be kind of butchering it, but let's just say Strahinja. And he had been raised by this woman who was, they estimated to be about 100 years old, let's say. And she just kind of took in all the stray kids, because this boy Strahinja, he was orphaned, and he was taken in by this lady. They called her Aunt Mirjana, and she would just kind of take care of the kids. And so then then the kids would take care of her. And once Strahinja reached a certain age, he fell in love with a young maiden by the name of Radojka, and he wanted to marry her, but her father did not approve. He was a young man who didn't really have a profession. He did have like a little hut that he'd inherited, but it wasn't much. The father of Radojka could not be particularly confident that he could take care of his precious daughter. And Strahinja had, before coming back to his village, been training with some carpenters. He had been an apprentice to them, and he had even traveled as far as Belgrade with them to learn their crafts. And so he had these friends, and he decided to go visit them. They were from the other village, because he just didn't know what to do about Radojka. And on his way there to the other village, he came by a water mill. And, until this story, I hadn't quite realized the complete significance of mills. You hear about them, windmill, like grist mill, all sorts of mills. Mills are what people use to grind wheat for bread. And bread is, especially for peasants and people who is just a staple of life, And so there was this water mill that was on the river between the two villages that was completely abandoned. And when he walked by the water mill, he got this sense of chill, like just being really cold, and it really scared him. He was like, why didn't I make this journey during the day? Like, he was regretting his choice. He just had a very weird sense. He was very chilled, and it was a summer's day, so it was very surprising for him for it to be so cold all of a sudden, unseasonably cold. The other thing that startled him was that the animals had gone completely silent. The normal night sounds of cicadas and the night birds like nightjars and owls hooting, completely gone. It was dead silent. That in itself was alarming. And luckily for him, he managed to find his path again and find his way back to the other village, where he immediately went to the tavern and found his friends, and the older, not old, but older than him, as he was a youth, kind of, the men who had trained him, the carpenters. And so he found them and told them what happened. He told them about how he had no idea how to win over or how to win the hand of Radojka from her father, who was determined that she would not marry him, and just felt hopeless and alarmed from going so close to that watermill. But he didn't talk to them about the watermill just yet. When the tavern keeper, the woman who worked there, came and asked him what he wanted, he said, "Oh, just some bread, please." And then the woman said, "Bread is one of the only things we don't have. Bread is very dear to us because we have to go far to mill the grain, and it's expensive." And he was puzzled because their village, the Strahinia's village, which was close to the other one, but they would go to a village closer on the other side of them to get their grain, and it was not super convenient, but it wasn't impossible to do, so they didn't have any shortage of grain, of milled ground grain to work with. And if you've ever tried to hand grind grain, it takes forever, and it's not maybe the best use of your time if you're living in a village and have a bunch of other things to do. So being able to grind grain with machinery was a big revolution. And so then he remembered the watermill and asked about it. And he learned that over the past century or so, there have been 3 different millers who had tried to inhabit the watermill and, set up the miller occupation. And he learned that they had all died of some kind of mysterious illness. And so with that, he thought that seemed rather suspicious, but his friends told him that both villages were so desperate to have a miller close by that both villages would probably pay him a full salary of a miller, and then maybe even 1.5 salary. So he potentially would be able to become a very profitable man, highly, with a profession highly desired if he could get that watermill working again. So he decided that he would try it. He wanted to marry Radojka, this girl he was in love with and who loved him in return. But her father prevented them from getting together and punished her whenever she did go see him. So what he did was he told his friends to go tell both villages that he would become the new miller, and he obtained promises from both villages that they would pay him a salary and a half to be a miller. And then his friends brought him to the mill. They made sure everything was functioning. It actually still was. So the water is what turns the 2 stones, I guess. That's the grinding stones of the mill. That's what actually powers it. So it's one of the most efficient ways to run a mill, because you don't need like any kind of manpower or animal power, because through nature, that's why a windmill is also very effective. Is watermill and windmill, you use nature to power the grinding stones to actually get them going. So they actually had a sack of grain that was brought back, and so Strahinja that night he ground the grain, and then what he did before his friends left him, though, his friends gave him 2 pistols, one with a regular bullet and one with silver coin that he could use as a bullet. So he had a pistol, one with silver, one with regular bullet, and they told him that whatever can't be killed with the normal bullet should be able to be killed with a silver bullet. You see the similarities with werewolf stories there? So with the silver bullet and the regular bullet pistols, he set out a plan that he would stay up all night and wait to see what would happen. So what he did was he set up some logs by the fire that he had built, and then he put a blanket over the logs to make it resemble a man sleeping by the fire. And with how cold that mill had gotten at night in that area, no wonder why somebody would sleep by the fire. And then he hid himself up in a loft area so that he could watch what happens. And then he waited. And at one point he drifted off and awoke to the dying embers of the fire and that seeping coldness that had just seeped into his bones and made him feel very insecure. And also, the silence of the night before was back. All of the sounds of the night were gone, and he knew that something was nearby. So what did he do? He readied himself, he got his pistols ready, and he watched as a tall figure entered. And he was very frightened. This tall figure was very pale and bald-headed and skeletal, except for the fact that his cheeks were very plump and red, almost bloated. They were so large. And as he watched, he saw this figure descend upon the fake man laying by the fire, the logs that he had built, and wrenched back the blanket and was so upset. And he said, and then the figure who was the skeletal figure said, "Oh, alas, in the first night in 90 years, Sava Savanović is going to go without a meal." He was very upset because this was the first night he would not be able to eat. But he said his name, and he said 90 years that he'd been. So he gave away some very key information right there. And so then Strahinja was so alarmed that he shot both pistols at the figure, and then it was startled and ran away. And then so Strahinja went back down. He reloaded his pistols just in case, to be sure if the figure came back. And then he went down by the fire, and he saw that he had knocked the finger off of that skeletal creature who had been there. And the rest of the night passed by without incident. He was very grateful for the dawn and the sun's return. And relieved, he brought his freshly milled sack of grain back to the tavern to find his friends, or wherever they had decided to meet. And he found them, and they were so relieved that he was still alive. And he told them what happened. And one of the men said, "It sounds like you've encountered a vampire." Strahinja had heard of vampires, but he didn't really know much about them. So he decided to try to figure out what he could do about the vampire, because he didn't want a repeat of the last night. So the men conferred for a bit, and they decided to go find a village priest. The village in the carpenter's village, the village priest in that village, he was kind of a drunkard and didn't seem very reliable. So they went to the village priest in Strahinja's village, and they talked to the priest and found out that the priest knew a thing or two about getting rid of vampires and also finding them. And part of that would be to find a stallion that they could bring over the grave of the vampire. But the problem was that they didn't know where he was buried. But luckily for them, he had said his name, so they knew kind of where to start. And nobody had heard of any Savanovićes in that area. So, of course, it had been 90 years that this guy had been a vampire. So his family line had pretty much ended with him, as they found out soon. And so they looked, the priest looked in like the village records and found record of a Sava Savanović and his brother, and like through baptismal records and funeral records, they could not find Sava's grave in the graveyard of the church. And so they were like, well, why? You know, you have to do something pretty bad to not be buried in the graveyard of the family. Meanwhile, they'd found the horse, and they'd brought the horse over all of the graves in the graveyard, and of course, the horse didn't freak out about any of them. Now, Dusan, Radojka's father, the father of the man that Strahinja wanted to marry, had actually overheard some of the conversation. And he told Strahinja that if you do this, if you kill this vampire and then become the miller, I will feel confident that you will be able to take care of my daughter. So with the support of his love's father, they decided to try to find who was old enough to have remembered the Savanović family, if there was anybody, and they realized it was Aunt Mirjana, the woman who had raised Strahinja. So they visited her, and he decided not to tell her about the encounter with the vampire because he didn't want to alarm her. But he tried to just ask her if she knew of Sava Savanović, and she grew white and pale and very fearful, and she said, "That man is cursed." And she told them the story of Sava Savanović. So Sava Savanović was a man who came from a family of millers. He lived in the mill, and he worked in the mill and milled grain for the villages, the two villages. But he was very unpopular. He was kind of a strange man with an obsession with butterflies. He liked to kill them and like preserve their carcasses and put them on display. And he also liked to do wood carvings. But at the same time, he was technically an eligible young man with a good profession, and the villagers were pressuring him to get married. But he didn't much like the company of others in general. But at one point, he met the daughter of a villager who was a little shepherd girl. She was maybe about 12. And he really liked her. He just liked spending time with her. She didn't seem to treat him as odd. She just treated him like a normal person and listened to his stories, and she enjoyed his company. And so he began to spend time with her, and over time he decided that she would be the one he wanted to marry. But her father greatly disapproved. He thought it was very strange that this older man would be interested in somebody so young. So he forbade her to go near him, and also forbade Sava from going near her. He decided that would not be fine. So Sava's younger brother, on one day that Sava was coming up to go see the little girl, his brother intercepted him and said, you must not go see the little girl. Her father has forbidden it, and he has 4 men there waiting with her to protect her. You're going to get hurt. And he basically was just kind of trying to keep his brother away, Sava, his older brother, away to protect him. And Sava grew angry and stabbed his brother. Nothing would keep him from the girl he had determined to marry. So after stabbing his brother, he walked back up walked back to where the girl usually was to go say hello to her. And she looked at him with her normal look, but then and greeted him cheerfully. But then she saw the blood covering his body, the fresh blood from his brother, and screamed and ran off. And it was then that those 4 men appeared, and looking behind Sava, seeing him covered in blood, and then looking behind him and seeing the still fresh body of his brother, the book I read described it as the freshly steaming body of his brother, which is a very vivid sort of imagery there. Decided, well, this guy is not a good person to keep around, and so they killed him. They just stabbed him repeatedly, and then they buried him by the river in what ended up being a too shallow of a grave, and that was that. So that is the story of Sava Savanović. He was kind of not a great man, not a good person, who killed his brother and creeped out the villagers, which I'm not saying it's always a bad thing to creep out your villagers, but, killing your brother who's trying to protect you is not really the best thing to do there. So anyway, in this story, he's pretty much deemed as a kind of soulless bad person. And so then, finding this out about Sava Savanović, they try to find his grave where he'd been buried, not really grave, just where he'd been buried. And so they were kind of running out of time, but they prepared themselves with hawthorn stakes, with holy water, and the priest brought his crucifix, and they brought the stallion, and they looked for where the grave could be. Hours and hours passed as they looked and looked and looked, because there were many potential locations that Mirjana had described, because it was described as being by a bend in the river. And so there were many situations. And finally, they found themselves by the mill, trying to decide if they should stay there for the night and in a group attack the vampire, take turns keeping watch, or if they should try to go back to the village. And as they were discussing, the horse was kind of wandering around grazing, and he reached a spot and started to freak out in alarm. And so the horse was pawing at the ground, just very alarmed, and he ended up digging to a certain point where they noticed it wasn't ground anymore that the horse was digging up. It was sort of a strange sound, and they discovered that it was the stump of a tree that Sava Savanović had allegedly been buried nearby. An elm tree. That's one of the landmarks that the aunt had told them about. And so they decided to hack away at the stump of the tree, and sure enough, beneath the tree they found a coffin. And so, bracing themselves, they raised the coffin, and Strahina stabbed the corpse in there, because they saw what they found was a corpse that was skeletal, with ruddy cheeks, but looking very much alive, not like a decomposed corpse. They stabbed the corpse, and Sava Savanović began to put up a fight. And so then the man who had the holy water kind of freaked out and was supposed to pour it directly in his mouth so he would be drowned in the holy water, but ended up splashing his face, which made him very red and infuriated him. And then the priest put his crucifix up against the face of the vampire, which burned his skin. And then one of the men cut the head off of the vampire. And so then they reburied him. They buried him much deeper. They put river stones on top of the coffin, and then the next day when they could, they planted a hawthorn bush on top of it. And so that was the end of Sava Savanović. But they decided, since he was buried so close to the mill, that they would just start a new mill that was donkey powered. So the father of Radojka, Dušan, paid for it, and then required that Strahinja work the mill, which of course he was happy to do. He married the daughter, and they lived happily ever after. And that mill is still there in Serbia. It did fall down at one point, but they are in the process of restoring it so that people can go visit. So if you ever find yourself in Serbia and wanting to see the mill that inspired the story, you still can. So this is just kind of my recollections of the story. I think I got a few details wrong, but that's how folk tales go, you know? You are telling the story, and then it's very much subject to the recollections of the teller. But yeah, it's interesting to see how there's differences, how the vampire lore has evolved so much over time, and how romantic it has become when it really started off with these reanimated corpses essentially coming and killing people. One of the things that was kind of interesting is how some vampires would come back, and especially if their wives were so-called young and pretty, they would come sleep with her again. And one of the legends I read mentioned that if a child was born out of a union with a vampire, it would be boneless, which is interesting. I would just wonder if that's like a phenomena that happens, and if that's an explanation for it. So, hope you enjoyed this foray into legends of vampires originating in Serbia. I certainly had fun reading about it.